priority in normative discussions and a dense, complex, lived meaning to those committed to it that philosophy also needs to understand if it's to understand what the ideal entails and what authority is actually merited. And there's nothing yet requiring any ponderous German metaphysics to make this point. When Alexis de Tocqueville tried to show that societies committed to a modern notion of liberty would be particularly susceptible to the appeal of a liberty-threatening egalitarianism, he attempted no metaphysical deduction from the concept itself. He turned his attention to the historical experiences of the Americans he met, their mores. And he didn't see his account as supplying mere empirical footnotes to a philosophical discussion. His historical sociology was intended as part of the assessment of that ideal, whether it amounted in actuality to a worthy human aspiration. Moreover, if it's plausible to consider the origin and even the authority of such normative commitments as unintelligible apart from the place of such commitments in a changing historical social organization, it's also highly plausible that any particular mode of investigating the rational credentials of such commitments is itself necessarily attached to some historical story. Argument forms determining what counts as a legitimating case also come attached to complex and developing histories and need the same sort of proper location in order to be understood. For example, the idea of appealing to what form of authority pre-social rational individuals would hypothetically choose to submit to is not something that would have simply made any sense, say, to Aristotle, just as refraining from appealing to the proper natural role of men and women to natural law would have greatly puzzled Aquinas. I have given in my title a general and polemical, and I hope it's clear, somewhat ironic name to these conditions, our historical conditions, bourgeois philosophy, suggesting there is a sort of philosophy appropriate to a historical epoch and a kind of society, and perhaps to a type of individual. This term itself has an interesting history, though, and I'll permit myself this brief digression. Its original meaning derives from feudalism. Certainly by the 11th century and long thereafter, the term simply designated an inhabitant of the bourg, a lieu fortifié surrounding a princely household. They were the people who lived inside the fortified walls, and while they were not noble, and so did not have the privilege of carrying arms in service of the king, they were entitled to privileges as bourgeois du roi, and so as tradesmen, artisans, and basically what we would call bureaucrats, were distinguished from the group who lived in open houses outside the walls, in the villa, or country houses, a villanus, or villain, a word with its own remarkable history, and certainly from the paysans, the serfs who lived farther out still. By the 17th century in France, though, much of the modern meaning of the term as an epithet, an insult, was well established. In French literature, in Corneille, Boileau, Poisson, and most famously in Molière, a bourgeois was already a person without dignity or merit, a craven social climber, vulgar, a Philistine, possessed of the means to enjoy the finer things in life, but with no clue how to do so, and terrified that such ignorance would be discovered. The man snoring through Wagner, or asking how much that Vermeer would cost. And bizarrely obsessed with respectability and the appearance of conventional morality. Only the appearances, because the bourgeois was also false, a hypocrite, a poseur. The local anti-pornography bourgeois is sure to be the one to have a huge stash of the stuff in his basement. Now, what's interesting about this history is that such expressions of distaste with the bourgeois and the whole way of life that emerges when they become the ruling class is that it is almost always tied to aristocratic nostalgia and a kind of aristocratic self-congratulation. To épater la bourgeoisie is to demonstrate that one is not a member. And if that cannot any longer place one in the nobility, it can help inch one closer to the hierarchy of cultural rank established by Romanticism and still so influential, the ranks of the truly creative, authentic, artistically sensitive appreciators of the finer things. This style of critique, so associated with the word, in other words, is not primarily political. Unequal wealth and unfair advantage are not usually primarily intended in the epithet, but cultural. It's important to note this aristocratic flavor in the use of the term as an epithet because it marks a kind of anxiety deeply connected with an important dimension of the problem of freedom. The bourgeois is held in contempt because he cannot act as the nobleman, at least in principle, paradigmatically acts. independently, in majestic indifference to what unworthy others think of what he does. The world of the bourgeois, indeed for Rousseau, the world of modern society itself, is a world of such complex, pervasive, and fragile dependencies that for the bourgeois, attempting such independence would be economic and social suicide. His range of independent action is limited not merely by his bad, craven character, but by the form of society that requires and rewards such cautious, reputation-protecting conduct. This question of the right way to understand the relation between independence and dependence will emerge as the most significant complexity in the modern aspiration to a free life, I want to suggest later. Indeed, it won't be long before Rousseau would characterize all of modern society as such an entangling network that he would urge a commitment to a radical ideal of freedom that would defeat it. He tells us in his second discourse, the savage lives in himself. Sociable man, always outside himself, is capable of living only in the opinion of others and, so to speak, derives the sentiment of his own existence solely from their judgments. The status of this kind of scorn for the bourgeoisie and the place of this sort of anxiety in American mass culture is quite interesting. There are stock figures now in American mass culture, bourgeois stereotypes everywhere. Archie Bunker and Homer Simpson, both members of the modern petite bourgeoisie or even working class bourgeoisie, and virtually any of the successful sitcom families. And perhaps the most brilliant contemporary realization, Tony Soprano, a renegade bourgeois whose very normality makes the normal seem mafiosa. This is interesting because while we're invited to laugh and thus elevate ourselves to a nobler height, almost all of these portrayals cannot conclude an episode or film without reminding us somehow that we are no better than they, or that they are as human, loving, and worthy as we are. For contrast, one might consider the middle-class monsters created in the films of Claude Chabrol, who turn out to be unredeemably awful. There is an anxiety, an unease in American laughter at the bourgeoisie. Our egalitarianism, and to some extent our guilt, require such closing moments of tenderness. If you watch TV, you know that some American men are apparently even anxious enough about their own vulgarity to overcome their usual homophobia and be made over by a group of gay men who descend on some poor soul and de-bourgeoisify him, under the assumption, I suppose, that gay men and middle-class women have some sort of immune system protecting them from bourgeois bad taste. But my digression will turn into its own talk. We need to remember Karl Marx. Thanks to Marx, the term came to be understood in terms of control of social power. It came to designate the middle class, or the owners of the means of production, or those closer to the control of capital, or the partisans of a private property-based social order, and ultimately a culture reflecting such commitments. The bourgeoisie care nothing important enough to achieve nobility, and can produce wealth only by exploiting the majority class, the workers. In Marx's hands, the category came to suggest one way in which historical narrative and connections with non-philosophical factors are essential to something like philosophy, namely that the norms in question can be subject to what he called ideology critique, a demonstration that an artistic style or religious practice or philosophical thesis, say about natural right or private property, gains some sort of social authority because the idea or practice is useful in helping to convince people to continue to accept the way in which social power is organized. And of course, this sort of critique is usually accompanied by an additional critique purporting to demonstrate that these class relations are inevitably doomed or inherently exploitative or similarly unacceptable. The idea is that a particular organization of social power tends to promote a kind of resistance to evidence and argument against such an organization, so much so that it might create a so-called false consciousness, a way of seeing the world wherein such possible tensions and counters are literally not even noticed or seen. So when you hurl the epithet bourgeois ideology at someone, you mean to indict him with the charge of advancing non-philosophical and ultimately unacceptable ends with these theses and claims, as when Marx famously called religion the opium of the masses, which prompted the clever counter that Marxism had become the opium of the intellectuals. We might also note, one last digression, that Marx was not at all free of what could only be described as a profound aristocratic cultural contempt for the bourgeoisie. The